Like with any previous version of Windows, in Windows 7, you of course need to have a user account before you're able to log on to your computer. Now it's this user account that identifies each person that uses the computer, and it provides the permissions to allow or restrict what a user's able to do within the Windows 7 operating system. Now it's behind the scenes that Windows 7 assigns each user account a security identifier, or SID as it's better known, which is really just a long number that's guaranteed to be a unique number even if you delete your user account and create another one with the same name. This SID is always going to be different. Now when you first log on to Windows 7, Windows checks to see that your username and your password matches. It then creates a security access token, which includes your username and this SID, along with any groups that your account belongs to. So when you try to access a resource on your computer, such as a file or a folder, Windows checks another thing called an ACL, or an access control list, for that resource. And every single resource has one. So this access control list is basically just a big list of SIDs, and depending on the access control list rules, it's then either going to grant or deny you access to the resource. And a bit later on in this video, I'll show you how you can determine what your own user account's SID is. So now that Windows 7's here, like we had with Windows Vista, Windows 7 includes something called user account control. So any administrator of a Windows 7 machine now has two security access tokens assigned to them. One of them is simply for a standard user account, and that's used for pretty much everything that they do in Windows. So even though they might be logged onto Windows 7 as an administrator, under the hood, you're really just a standard user for most tasks. Now, the other security access token that an administrator has is for the full privileges of the administrator, but it's really only called into play when you attempt to perform a task that does require elevated privileges. Now, by the way, even though I did mention a moment ago that these SIDs, every one of them, has got to be unique, there are a couple of exceptions to that rule. Built-in accounts like your local system account, they're common across Windows installations. So if you're interested and you want to get a big list of all of these SIDs, just head off to your favorite search engine, do a search for Windows SIDs, and you're going to find a few sites that'll list them for you. Now, of course, when you first installed your copy of Windows 7, you had to create a user account. So let's go and take a look at the properties of a user account, and we'll also see how we can create additional user accounts for other people that need to use our computer. So down here, we're going to click on Start, and we're going to right-click on Computer, and we'll select Manage. Now in our Computer Management Console on the left-hand side here, we're going to expand Local Users and Groups, and we'll select the Users container. Okay, well in the middle of our console you can see we have three accounts by default, those being the administrator account, the built-in guest account, and the account that you created when you installed Windows 7. So my account here is called Trainer. Yours is most likely to be called something else. Now, if we right-click on one of these accounts, let's use our Trainer account. We've got options here to set or change the password for this account. On the All Tasks menu here, we've got the same thing. We can set or change our password. We can choose to delete this account if we no longer require it. We can rename it to something else, and we can check out the properties. So let's select Properties, and that'll open up a new window where we have these three tabs. So firstly, on the General tab, we can provide a full name and a description for this account if we like. And if you're a home user with one or two accounts, you really don't need to fill in this sort of stuff because it is optional. But if you are working in a corporate environment, or you have a lot of people that are going to be using this computer, then it might be a good idea to complete these fields. That way, it's easy to identify later on what this account's being used for or who the account's being used by. Now we can see down here we've got a bunch of checkboxes. The first one, user must change password at next logon. That's grayed out, as you can see. But when we create new accounts later on, you'll see that we're able to enable this feature. So the user that we're creating the account for is able to set their password when they first log onto the computer. And that's really a good idea because it's going to save potential arguments later on. For example, if I was to create a user account for Bob and set his password to, well, whatever I wanted to set it to, and then I hand that account over to Bob and he starts using it. Now, if he doesn't go ahead and change that password to something else, and then something goes wrong with his account, for example, some files have been deleted or he suspects that someone's been looking at his email, the first person that Bob is going to suspect is me because I know his password. So by making them change it the very first time they log on, you're simply going to avoid all of that potential aggravation later on. Now we can also set the account so that the user can't change their password, which is really the opposite of what we just talked about with the previous setting. But this is also a useful feature when we have service accounts that we can use to run programs and we don't want that password being changed. Now we can also set the password so that it never expires. And by default, the first account you create on Windows 7, which is automatically going to be an administrator account, is going to have this box checked, which you can see it is for my trainer account. But for any user really, for best security, you should force users to change their passwords regularly. Now we saw a moment ago when we right-clicked on this account that we could delete it, but we could also disable this account as well if we like. And that's a good security measure when a user goes on holiday, for example. We know they're going to come back, so we don't want to delete their account, but if it's not needed at the moment, we can disable it and then re-enable it later on when they come back. In fact, up here, if you take a look at these icons, you'll see that the two inbuilt accounts by default are actually disabled. You can see this little downward pointing arrow that's over the icon, and at a glance, that's going to show you that these accounts are disabled. Now finally, down the bottom here, if an account is locked out due to reasons such as a user's entered in the wrong password a certain number of times, then they're not going to be able to log on, and Windows is going to check this box. So as an administrator, I could come into our console here, uncheck this box, and that'll re-enable the account and possibly also reset their password. Now the next tab is the Member Of tab, and here we're able to see all of the groups that this user account belongs to. And my trainer account here belongs to the administrators group, but we can simply add or remove our accounts from other groups by using these two buttons below. Now finally, our third tab, the Profile tab here. This allows us to use mandatory or roaming user profiles, and we can enter in here a UNC path for where you want this user's profile to be stored. But admittedly, most of the items that you see on this tab here are never going to be touched by home users anyway. But in a corporate environment, we could assign logon scripts for this user. We could also change the home folder path for the users folder, which in my case would default to the users folder on my C drive in a folder called Trainer. But we could change it if we like, and also finally, we could map this users folder to a network drive, and we could specify the drive letter and the UNC path to the folder. Now, like I said, for a client operating system like Windows 7, it's really unlikely, especially if you're a home user, you're ever going to use these features. But in a domain environment, you most likely will. But you won't configure those options here. You'll do that in Active Directory. But at least if you didn't know what they do, well, now you do. Well, let's click Cancel, and let's see how we can add in a new user account. Now to do that, we'll simply right-click. We'll choose the top option, New User. Firstly, we'll need to give this new user a username. So let's call this guy Lucas. We can also enter in an optional full name for this user account and an optional description as well. Now next, we will need to enter in a password for Lucas. So let's type in a password. And we'll need to type it in again to confirm that we've spelt it correctly. Now, as you can see, the default here for Lucas is that he will need to change his password the very first time he logs onto this computer. And we've already spoken about that. But if we decide to uncheck this box, then these next two options, they become available so that we can set Lucas's account so that he can't change his password, or we could set it to never expire. Now finally at the bottom, if we were creating this account for Lucas ahead of time, but he doesn't need it yet, we could also set it to be disabled. Now it's pretty unlikely, again in a home environment, you're going to need this disable feature, but in a corporate environment where people can come and go regularly, this could be used quite frequently. Alright, so what we're going to do here is we're going to set Lucas's account back at the top here so that he must change his password the next time he logs on, which of course is going to be the first time he logs on, and we'll click Create. Okay, now we've created his account, and you'll see that this window here does stay open just in case you need to create more accounts. So we're done with it. We'll click Close, and there we can see Lucas's account, which is enabled, ready for him to log on. Now we can also create accounts from a different place in Windows 7 as well. So if we go and click Start, and we'll fire up the control panel. Up here we have a link to add or remove user accounts. Now here we can see our 2 accounts that we've created, and down the bottom here we have a link to create a new user account. Now this window here definitely makes it easy for your average home user who might not have a lot of technical knowledge of Windows to be able to create accounts. All we need to do here is enter in a name for our user, so I'll call this guy Jordan, and then we need to decide whether Jordan should be a standard user or an administrator. So for your average user, I'm going to leave him at standard user and click Create Account. Okay, well, there you can see we've just created Jordan's account. It's been created, it's ready for him to use it, but this method of creating accounts does have one small problem. Jordan's account doesn't have a password, and as such it isn't secure at all. Although that might be fine for some home users to have their computer set up that way, but personally I'd never create an account without a password. And at a glance, if you haven't already picked up on it, you can see under Jordan's account here, under his icon, it doesn't say password protected, whereas these other ones, the trainer one, trainer, administrator, password protected, Lucas, standard user, password protected, Jordan, standard user, nothing about a password. So let's fix that. We'll click on Jordan's account, and you can see over here we've now got a few options that we have with his account. We can change Jordan's account's name. We can create a password, what we want. We can change the picture, this picture here that's associated with Jordan's account. We can set up parental controls to track or restrict what Jordan's allowed to do on this computer, and we're going to talk about that in another video. We can change his account type from obviously his standard user account to an administrator account and vice versa. And we could also delete his account. So let's create a password for Jordan. We'll click the second link, create a password. And we'll get this big bold warning here in the middle telling us that if we do create a password for Jordan, he's going to lose any encrypted files, personal certificates, and stored password for websites or network resources, if any of those things are applicable. But for us, that's okay because it is a new account and Jordan hasn't even logged on yet. So we'll create a password for him. Let's just type it in. And we'll type that in again. And you'll also note that down here we can also create a password hint for Jordan. Something that can jog Jordan's memory to what his password really is in case he forgets it. But that's an entirely optional step. I won't bother with that for now. We'll just click Create Password. And we're done. You can see he's now got a password protected account. Now if you happen to be feeling a little more adventurous, you could also choose to create user accounts from the command prompt as well. Although you will need to open up the command prompt in an administrator mode, or you'll be denied the ability to create any new accounts. So let's do that. Let's click Start. We're going to type in CMD, and we're going to hold down the Shift key and the Control key on our keyboard, and I'm going to hit Enter. That'll invoke user account control, something we'll talk about in another video. For now, we're going to say a yes to allow this command prompt to fire up in administrator mode. And you can see at the top here in the title bar, it says administrator. So we'll type in net user, and if we just hit enter now without providing any other additional arguments, we're going to get back a list of all of the accounts we currently have on this Windows 7 machine. And there should be 5 by now. We have the built-in administrator account, the built-in guest account, which of course are both disabled by default, and the 3 that I've created, the initial trainer account, the administrator account in my case, and Lucas and Jordan, which of course we created during the process of this video. Right, so to add in a new account, we're going to run the net user command again, followed by the /add switch, and then the name of the new user. So let's call this new user Kayla. And if we hit enter right now, what's going to happen is Kayla's account is going to be created, but like with Jordan's account, she's not going to have a password. So we'll add in a password. In fact, let's just add in a password of password. Not that that's a very good one, but we'll hit enter. We can see the command completed successfully. So that seemed to work fine. If we go back to our computer management console here and we just refresh the screen, we can see there is Kayla's account. All right, well, while we're here with our command prompt open, let's quickly go back there because I did tell you a little earlier in this video that I'd show you how you can determine what your own security identifier or SID is. So let's just clear the screen, and we'll do that by typing in CLS and hit enter. And if we use the command who am I with the /user switch, that's going to return to you the account that you're currently logged on with along with your own security identifier. So we can see for this machine, our host name of our machine is called Windows 7B. I'm logged on using the trainer account, and this big long number here is my security identifier. So for what it's worth, if you wanted to know how to find out your own SID, that's how you'll do it, using the who am I /user switch. All right, well, let's go back to our control panel for a moment. I think I have that open up here somewhere. I do. There we go. And I'm going to click on this green user accounts and family safety link. Then I'm going to click user accounts. And over here on the left, we have this ability here. We've got this link to create a password reset disk. And that's important just in case you forget what your password is. So let's click that. Now this starts up a small wizard, but before we dive in and just blindly click next here, if you decide to read this text, you'll be told that whilst this password reset disk we're about to create will allow you to create a new password and log onto your computer if you get in trouble, but if someone else gets hold of your password reset disk, they too will be able to change your password and log on and access your file. So bear that in mind if you plan on leaving this disk lying around for others to find. All right, well, we'll assume that we're smart enough not to do that, so we'll click next. We'll firstly be asked where we want to save this disk to, in which in my case simply defaults to my A drive. It's my only floppy drive on this machine. We'll click next. And now we'll need to enter in our current user account password. So since this helps you reset your password, it's probably a good idea to run through this wizard now whilst we still remember what our password actually is. So simply enter in your password here and click next, and we'll be prompted to put the floppy disk in our drive if we don't have one in the drive at the moment. And I do, so as you can see, in my case, the password disk has been created automatically. So it's done, it's pretty quick. We're going to click next and then finish. Now that's done, we're able to store our disk somewhere safe just in case we need to call on it later on if we forget our password. So let's see how it works. What I'm going to do is I'm going to log off this computer and we can see how we can use that password reset disk to reset our password. Okay, so I've just logged off. We're here at our familiar logon screen. We've all seen that before. So for my trainer account, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to enter in an incorrect password first. So let's just enter in some random garble. We'll hit enter. We're told our password isn't correct, so we're going to hit enter again. And you'll note that now, underneath our password box here, because we've entered our password incorrectly once, we've got this new option appear for us to be able to reset our password. In fact, we are also given a password hint, which I just set up of password. So if that doesn't jog our memory, we're able to then use this password or reset password link. So let's select that. It's going to fire up this password reset wizard. So let's click next. Now we'll be prompted to choose which drive has our password reset disk, which in my case, of course, is my A drive. So we'll click next. And finally, Now that our password disk has been verified, we'll need to enter in a new password. So let's type in a new one. And we're going to do it again just to confirm it. And finally, we could also enter in an optional password hint that might help us remember our password later on. So let's just click Next. And we're done. Our password has now been reset. We've now changed it. And once we click Finish, we're then simply able to log on as before using our new password. Now, keep in mind that if anyone else finds your password reset disk, they'll be able to reset your password just as easy as you saw me do right now. So if you use this password disk option, make sure that you keep the disk in a safe place. All right, well, let's move on, as there is another thing we should consider looking at before we wrap up our discussion of user accounts, and that's taking a look at the local security policy. So to do that, we're going to click the Start button. We'll go to our control panel. Up the top, we'll choose System and Security. Now, down the bottom, we're going to choose Administrative Tools. And from here, we can launch the local security policy. Now, personally, I think it's rather a long, drawn-out lot of clicks for us to get to this place. So if you'd prefer to do this, I'd add this window to our Start menu. And to do that, it's pretty easy. We're going to right-click on our Start icon. We'll select Properties. Up the top, we'll choose the Customize button. And then we're going to scroll all the way down to the bottom, and here's our System Administrative Tools, which is this window here. And we'll choose to display it on our All Programs menu and the Start menu. So we'll click OK, OK again. In fact, let's just close this down. Now when we click Start, there's a new option here, Administrative Tools. And from this flyout menu, we can now launch our local security policy. So let's do that. Here it is. And over on the left-hand side here, we've got a bunch of options. The one we're looking for is the first one, Account Policies. Let's expand that. And then we'll choose Password Policy. Now, I will say right up front that for most of the policies that you see in here, most users of Windows 7, especially home users, they're not ever going to touch or perhaps even know that these policies even exist. But they do exist, of course, and making changes here can make your Windows 7 computer even more secure. Now, these policies aren't new to Windows 7, by the way. They were there in XP, they were there in Windows Vista, and of course, they're here in Windows 7. So let's take a look. The first policy we have here is to enforce our password history. Now, what this policy does is it keeps track of all of the passwords that we've used for this account in the past. Now, you see it's currently set to 0 passwords remembered, which is basically the same as saying this policy is disabled. It's not in effect. Now, what this policy does is it maintains a list of all of the passwords that a user has used in the past, and if they change their current password, then they're not going to be able to change it back to a password that they've used in the past. So if we set this to any value other than 0, which is what it is now, then it's that number of passwords that are going to be remembered. So this means if we create a user account, and let's say we set this value to 2, later on our user changes their password to something else. So what that means is they're not going to be able to go back and reuse that same password they had before until they've cycled through at least 2 other different passwords. Now, on a default installation of a Windows Server operating system, specifically Windows Server 2003 and Windows Server 2008, this number here is set to 24. Now, obviously here it's set to 0, which is disabled, and we are talking about a client operating system here, so probably we don't need to set it so high. But if you do want to force your users to be able to create new, unique passwords each time, then you should set this to a higher value, and that'll have to make them think of new passwords more frequently. Now, since you know how to create a password reset disk, and we've seen that in action, then a forgotten password really isn't the end of the world. So to change any of these values here, the policies are basically the same. We're going to right-click on one, we'll choose Properties, and simply change this value here to whatever you like. So if we wanted to set it to say 5, we'd type in 5, and then click OK. All right, well, our next policy here, the maximum password age, it's currently set to 42 days. So that means users are only going to be able to use the same password for 42 days before Windows forces them to change it. Now, next we have the minimum password age. Now, this setting works with our maximum password age in the sense that it's best practice to have a minimum amount of time before users can change their password. Now, the reason for this setting is, let's say we have a user who has a favorite password. Let's say my password is basketball. So all I would theoretically have to do is, once my 42 days is up and I'm forced to change my password, I could just change my password to something new and do that as many times as is specified in our minimum password age policy, which is currently none, and then I can reset my password straight back to my favorite of basketball, thus defeating the whole point of forcing me to change it in the first place. So by setting a minimum time here of, say, at least 1 day, that means that I'll be forced to use my new password for at least a day before I'm able to change it. Now, sure, it also does mean that I'm able to go back to using my password of basketball after 1 day. But if I was then to set this to something a little higher, like 24, which is the default on a Windows server, then the user, in other words me, I'm probably going to get sick and tired of trying to change my password all the time. But that said, look, the default here for Windows 7 is 0, which is disabled. So even after 42 days, we are going to force our users to change their password, but there's nothing stopping me from changing it back to the old one straight away. Now, next we have a minimum password length here of 0 characters, which isn't really good from a security standpoint. That means that user accounts really don't have any restrictions on small passwords. I could essentially use a single letter or a number, or even worse, I could use no password at all. So personally, I'd change this to force users to use at least a 7 or 8 character password. Now, this next setting here, this is one that's been turned on by default on Windows 2003 and Windows 2008 servers, and in all honesty, even though we're dealing with potentially a home user or with Windows 7, I think this policy should be turned on as well. Let's look at what it says. Password must meet complexity requirements. So let's talk about what these complexity requirements are. So these complexity requirements, when we enforce them, it means that in order to successfully use a password, it's got to meet or exceed the requirements that we'll talk about here. So first of all, the password must not contain part of or all of the user's username. So, for example, if our user we created a moment ago, which was Lucas, if we created, or if we were changing his password and we decided to enforce complexity requirements, then he wouldn't be able to use the password of Lucas. He also wouldn't be able to use the password of Lucas123 because both of these contain the username Lucas. Now, his password would also have to be a minimum of at least 6 characters. Any less than that, and the new password is going to be rejected. Of course, more characters than 6 is allowed. And for security purposes, it's also recommended that you have a good long password. Of course, the only downside to having a long password is that it's a bit more of a pain for you to type in, but the longer and more complex it is, the better your security. Now, another thing a complex password must also contain is characters from at least 3 of the following 4 categories. Now, it can use any uppercase character from A through to Z. It can use any lowercase character from A through to Z. It can use any number from 0 through to 9. And finally, it can also use special characters as well. And most of those special characters are characters that you'd normally enter in via the keyboard when you hold down the Shift key. Things like an exclamation mark, things like an @ symbol, things like a $, and so forth. So a complex password will require you to use characters from at least 3 of these sections. So ordinarily, we're told that the most popular password in history is the word password. Now, of course, if we were turning on complexity requirements, that password there wouldn't be successful. It would fail because it certainly does not meet any of these 4 categories. Now, if we did want to use the word password but make it comply with our complexity requirements, we could use an uppercase P. For the A, we could use the @ symbol, and then simply enter in the rest of the word in lowercase. And that password would meet the complexity requirements because we're containing an uppercase character, a special character, 1 or more lowercase characters, and of course we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 characters when we need at least 6. Now, I probably should add that having a variation of the word password for your password is still not a great one as far as security is concerned. But we're just using this for our example, so you'd certainly want to choose something far less guessable for your own benefit in the real world. Now, you could, however, consider making this password even more secure by taking some of the other letters and replacing them with numbers. For example, we could take these 2 S's here and replace them with the number 5. We could replace the 0 here with, or the O rather, with a 0. Again, even though this is a far more secure password than actually using the word password, variants on the word password itself aren't particularly recommended, so I'd suggest use your brain and think of something else. Okay, so that's the complexity requirements for users' passwords in Windows 7. Now, of course, although we've just been through that whole discussion about what complexity requirements are and how they work, realize that this policy is, of course, disabled. And personally, I'll enable it for better security, but at the end of the day, it's entirely up to you. Now, if you do enable this policy, users that you may have created earlier without passwords or with weak passwords that don't meet this requirement, they'll still be able to log on just fine. It just means that the next time they change their password, or if you create a new user account from this point on, then these complexity requirements will be enforced at that time. So by enabling this policy, everything is going to stay the same until the next password change or any new user accounts that you create, and only those will then be enforcing those complexity requirements. Now, before we close this local security policy, we'll take a look at the last setting here, which is to store our passwords using reversible encryption. Now, as it sounds, if we enable this policy, it's going to store our passwords using encryption that's reversible. And to be honest, storing passwords using reversible encryption is basically the same as storing them in plain text. It's rubbish as far as security is concerned. So don't enable this policy unless you've got old applications that have to know users' passwords for authentication purposes. Now, this policy, by the way, will also be required if you are using the CHAP or Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol through remote access or Internet Authentication Services, or if you happen to be using Digest Authentication in IIS. Now, the default, of course, is disabled, so unless you do have a mandatory requirement to enable it, I'd just leave it as it is. Alright, so that's our local security policy options. Again, it's not so likely that you'll be mucking around with these if you're a home user with a PC or 2 at home, but hey, they're there, and if you want to work on improving your own security, by all means go ahead. Okay, well, we've taken quite a long look at user accounts and how they all work, so the next thing we need to discuss in this video is groups. Now, when you have only a single user on your Windows 7 computer, groups for the most part, they're unnecessary. However, once your number of users grows, even with just one more user added to the computer, groups suddenly start to become a very attractive option. So let's say, for argument's sake, you've got 2 or more users that need access to a folder on your computer. Now, without groups, you'll need to explicitly add each user to an access control list, which is basically just a list of permissions, and then grant them the appropriate permissions to that folder. Now, groups can help you simplify administration on your computer because it's far easier to create a group and place a whole bunch of user accounts into that group and then assign permissions to the group once. So let's go and create a group. We'll talk more about this along the way. So let's go and close this. We're going to go to our computer management console. We're going to click Start, right-click on our computer again, and choose Manage. All right, we're here. We'll expand local users and groups, and this time we're going to select the Groups container. Now, unlike our user accounts, in the middle of our console here, you can see we've got quite a lot of groups that come inbuilt with Windows. So let's briefly talk about what these built-in groups do, because some of you listening might not be fully aware of what they're actually used for. So let's just expand this out a little bit so we can sort of see what's going on. At the top here, we have the Administrators group, which is the group that contains the most powerful user account in Windows, the Administrator account. And that, of course, is the first account you've created when you first installed Windows 7. Now, an Administrator account, of course, lets you do pretty much anything you want to do on your computer, including make system-wide changes to practically anything, as well as other users' files and folders, and you can also assign permissions to other user accounts. Next, we have the Backup Operators group, and people that are part of this group are able to back up and restore files on this computer regardless of what other permissions they have. This means that if your account is a member of this group, you're able to back up files that you might not ordinarily have access to. Now, you mightn't be able to open those files or view them or run them, but you can back them up and you can restore them. Now, next we've got the Cryptographic Operators group, and as the description says here, members of this group are able to perform cryptographic operations. We have the Distributed COM Users group, and that allows our users to launch and use DCOM objects. The Event Log Readers group allows people from this group to be able to read our event logs. We've got the Guests group, which grants the same rights as a standard user to the person logging onto Windows 7, except that members of this group will have their user profile deleted when they log off the computer, whereas a standard member of a user's group is going to have their profile remain on the computer when they log off. So each guest user, every time they log on, is going to create a temporary new user profile, a default user profile, and if they log off and back on again, they're always going to have a new one created. All right, next we've got the IIS group, which is a group that's used by Internet Information Services to access content on behalf of anonymous users that are requesting web pages from your Windows 7 computer. Now, IIS isn't enabled by default, and we do have other videos where we talk about IIS if you're interested. Now, next we have the Network Configuration Operators group, which grants its members the ability to make TCP/IP network changes, such as change the IP address of this computer, or release a DHCP address and renew one, and so forth. Performance Log Users allows our users to manage our performance counters and our logs and our alerts on this computer. And we also have the Performance Monitor Users, which enables members to monitor performance counters on this computer and remote ones. We also have a Power Users group here, and it's important to understand that this group here is really only here for backwards compatibility with older operating systems. You see, in previous Windows operating systems, you'd often have situations where you had some users that needed slightly more power or more authority to do things than a standard user account provided, such as they needed the ability to install applications or run applications with greater permissions. Now, ordinarily, that meant you'd need to add their user account into the Administrators group or the Power Users group. In Windows 7, we're now doing away with this Power Users group, but it's still there just in case you need it, but it doesn't give you any more permissions than a standard user account does. All right, next we have the Remote Desktop Users group, and being a member of this group allows you to log on remotely to this computer using Remote Desktop. And by default, only the administrators do have that access to log on remotely. Next, we have the Replicator group, which is there for replication functions, and you don't need to add any local accounts to this group. It's really only here for domain accounts that need to log on to this computer in order to support logging on to the replication service. Now, finally, we've got the Standard Users group, which we've already talked about. All right, now, with those explanations out of the way, let's go ahead and create our own group. So to do that, like with our user account, we're going to right-click, choose the top option, New Group. Now, firstly, we'll need to give our group a name, so I'm going to call my group Sales, and we can again provide an optional description if we like. we'll then need to add in some members for our group, because obviously a group without any members really isn't much of a group. So down the bottom, we're going to choose the Add button, and we're going to add in user accounts from this computer. Now, if you already know the name of the user account you want to add in, you can type it in here, or at least part of it. So if we wanted to add in the user account for Jordan, which we created earlier in this video, we could start typing in Jordan and click the Check Names button, and it'll find and populate the full user account for Jordan for us. Now, alternatively, if you don't know the correct spelling of the account that you wish to add, let's just delete that for the moment. We can click the Advanced button. Over here, we'll click the Find Now button. And now we're able to scroll down and locate all of our accounts. And from this window, in fact, we can choose one or more accounts if we like. So we could add in Jordan. We could also add in, say, Lucas as well. And to select multiple of these or unselect them, we just need to hold down the Control key on our keyboard and then click the mouse. All right, so we'll add in Jordan, we'll add in Lucas, we'll click OK. We'll click, there's both the accounts, we'll click OK again. Now we can see both Jordan and Lucas's accounts are being added here to our new sales group. So if we click Create and then click Close, we'll be able to see here, there's our new sales group. And if we double click on that, inside we'll be able to see both accounts in that group. Okay, so now that we've got a group created, it's much easier for us now to manage permissions, because we can assign the sales group permissions to a resource, such as a file or a folder. And then each member of the group, in this case Jordan and Lucas, they're both going to be able to have permissions to access that resource. And we only need to assign the permission once, just to the group, not to each account individually. Now, of course, if you've only got one single user on your Windows 7 computer, then groups really aren't going to be much use to you. But if you do have lots of people on your computer, I could have 10 people on this computer, then creating groups and assigning permissions to the group is a whole lot easier to manage, and it's quicker to get things working. Now, also, when you need to add another person to the group later on, they might need access to the same files and folders as these two guys here. Then by adding that user to this group, they're immediately going to have access to everything that people in the sales group also have access to. Now, we can also, by the way, create groups at the command prompt as well, just like we did with our user accounts. So let's click Start. We're going to type in CMD. Again, hold down Control and Shift and hit Enter. And we'll say yes here. And again, at the top, just make sure that you're seeing the word administrator there. That'll show you that you are running your command prompt in administrator mode. So we're going to type in net, and this time we're not going to type in user, we're going to type in local group. And like before, if we just hit enter right now, we're going to see all of the groups that we currently have on our Windows 7 machine. And there you can see all of the building groups, the administrator groups, the backup operators groups, even our sales group that we created a moment ago. So to create a new group, again, we're going to type in a net local group followed by the /add switch, just like we did for our user account. And by the way, if you do want to delete a group from your command line, just change this add to /delete, and that'll do the trick right there. So if we wanted to delete, say, our sales group, in fact, let's just type this in again, we'd type in net local group delete sales. Okay, we certainly don't want to delete that group. We want to add a new one, so let's type in add /add. And we'll need to supply the name of a group that we want to add. So let's call this group, we've got sales, so we'll go with marketing, and we'll hit enter. Now we'll type in net local group again, and this time we're going to get back a list that also contains a group called marketing. And of course, if we go back to our computer management console here and then we refresh it, in fact, I think we'll have to just hit F5 here to refresh that. There you go. There's our new marketing group. So in this video, we've seen just how simple it is to create local users and local groups in Windows 7. Now just remember that when you add new user accounts to Windows 7 from within the Control Panel application, that they aren't required to have a password by default. And from a security perspective, that's a very bad idea, as it lets anyone into your computer if they're able to get physical access to it. So make sure that you add a password to any user account that you create for your own privacy and security's sake. Now also keep it in mind that if you've got a really, really bad memory and you're always forgetting your passwords, we saw that we do have a password reset disk option in our control panel, and that can help you get out of a jam later on. So as long as you remember where you left your disk, you're going to be fine. So to be clear, if you can't remember your password, at least remember where you left your password reset disk. And if you're in the habit of forgetting your password, then right now's a good time to go create that password disk. So go on, do it now. We hope you've enjoyed this video and would like to thank you for watching.